The vote was already halfway done when I realized they were not going to stop it. I sat in the human seat of the Galactic Council chamber, in a room so large that clouds sometimes formed near the ceiling, and I watched 300 delegates decide, one by one, that my species was a problem. My name is Claire Bennett. I had been the human ambassador for 11 years, and on that morning I learned that 11 years of work can be erased in a single hour. The chamber was silent, except for the soft chime that sounded every time a delegate cast a vote. Chime. A vote against us. Chime. Another. I kept my hands flat on the desk in front of me because I did not trust them not to shake. Across the great circle of the room, the Velthari delegate would not look at me. He had eaten dinner at my table only 2 months earlier. He had laughed at my jokes. Now he pressed his voting panel and stared at the floor. The charge against humanity was written in polite language, the way all cruel things are written in that chamber. It said that humans were a destabilizing influence on galactic order. It said that we moved too quickly, that we ignored ancient procedures, that we solved problems that were not ours to solve. It recommended that humanity be removed from full membership and reduced to observer status. Observer, a species that may watch but may not speak, a species that may exist but may not matter. I want to be honest with you, because you deserve honesty. Every word of the charge was true. We were disruptive. When the famine struck the Ravik worlds, the council formed a committee, and the committee formed a subcommittee, and the subcommittee scheduled a review, and the review estimated that relief would reach the starving in 40 years. 40 years. Human agricultural ships arrived in 8 months. We did not ask permission. We did not file the correct forms. We simply went, and we fed them, and 4 billion Ravik children grew up because of it. The council never forgave us for that. Not because we fed the hungry, but because we proved that they could have done it too, and chose not to. When the Osari and the Keth declared each other irreconcilable enemies, a word the council uses when it has given up, a human negotiation team spent 3 years living between the two fleets. Living there, sleeping on their ships, learning their songs, eating their food, even the food that made us sick, and at the end of 3 years, 2 species who had hated each other for 6 centuries signed a peace agreement in a human dining hall. Over a meal our cooks had spent a month learning to prepare. The council issued a formal statement praising the peace. Privately, they were furious. We had made 10,000 years of their diplomacy look like decoration. So yes, the charges were true. We embarrassed them. That was our real crime. Every time a human ship arrived somewhere fast, every time a human doctor cured something the council had labeled incurable, every time a human engineer fixed a relay that had been broken for a generation, we held up a mirror, and the oldest species in the galaxy did not like what they saw in it. The final chime sounded. The chamber's central light shifted from blue to amber, the color of a past resolution. The speaker, a tall Ilith named Varen, rose from his seat. Ilith are graceful beings, thin as reeds, with voices like wind through glass, and Varen had always been fair to me. I could hear the regret in him when he spoke, even though the words were formal. "The resolution is adopted," he said. "Humanity's membership in the Galactic Council is hereby restructured. The human delegation is granted until the end of the current cycle to conclude its affairs." Restructured. What a soft word for a door closing. Every delegate in that chamber turned to look at me. I knew what they expected. They expected the famous human fire. They expected me to stand and shout, to appeal, to threaten, to demand a recount, to fight the way humans always fight. Some of them, I think, were looking forward to it. It would have confirmed everything they had just voted for. An emotional species, an unstable species. See how she rages. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I looked around that enormous room, at faces I had known for a decade, at species I had defended in 100 debates, at delegates whose worlds had human hospitals and human schools and human rescue stations quietly holding their frontiers together, and I felt something unexpected settle over me. Not anger. Something colder and much calmer. Something like certainty. "Honored delegates," I said, and my voice carried through the chamber the way it always had. "Thank you for 11 years of education. Humanity has learned a great deal in this room. We understand your decision. We will not appeal it. We will be out of your way by the end of the cycle." That was all. 20 seconds. Then I gathered my tablet, pushed in my chair the way my mother taught me when I was 6 years old, and walked out of the Galactic Council for the last time as a member. The silence behind me was enormous. I have replayed that silence many times since, and I understand it better now than I did then. It was not the silence of victory, it was the silence of 300 beings who had just gotten exactly what they asked for, and who felt, somewhere deep in whatever passes for their stomachs, the first small flutter of doubt. The walk from the chamber to the human offices takes 11 minutes. I know because I had made that walk more than 4,000 times. That day it felt both longer and shorter, the way the walk away from a funeral does. The corridors of the council station are lined with living crystal that glows in the colors of whoever passes. For 11 years it had glowed warm gold around me. Humans found that funny. "The station likes us," my staff used to joke. That day the crystal glowed gold around me the whole way, steady and bright, as if the station itself had not heard the news yet. My office was on the 90th level, with a window that looked out over the docking rings. I stood at that window for a long moment and watched the ships come and go. Freighters from 100 worlds, diplomatic cruisers, medical transports. So many of them crewed by humans, or guided by humans, or repaired by humans, or flying routes that humans had charted because nobody else had bothered. I made a mental note of every one of them. It was the first item on a list that would grow very long over the next 6 months. Then I started to pack. I had expected to pack alone. I did not. Within an hour, they started coming. First it was Morel, the Osari records keeper from the archive level, who had worked beside our historians for 9 years. She stood in my doorway holding a small clay bowl, an Osari friendship bowl, the kind their families keep for generations, and she pressed it into my hands and could not speak. Osari cannot cry. Their bodies do not do it. But their skin turns pale gray when they grieve, and Morel's hands were the color of ash. Then came the Keth dock supervisor, Tovan, a huge armored being who had once lifted a crashed loader off a human mechanic and then visited that mechanic in the medical bay every single day for a month. He shook my hand, human style, very carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of breaking, and he said only 4 words. "This is a mistake." Then the Ravik kitchen staff, all 11 of them, who left a covered dish on my desk and hurried away before I could thank them. Then the young Velthari translator, who had learned English so well she dreamed in it. Then the station medics. Then the maintenance crews. All afternoon and all evening they came, quietly, one by one and in small groups, the working beings of the council station, the ones who never voted on anything, and every one of them shook my hand, or touched my shoulder, or simply stood in the doorway for a moment, with their grief showing in whatever way their species shows it. Not one delegate came. Not one. Near midnight, when the office was finally empty and my life on that station fit into 4 gray cases, I sat down at my desk one last time and opened a channel to Earth. The face that appeared belonged to Alice Turner, the head of our government, a silver-haired woman with a farmer's hands and the patience of stone. She had already heard, of course. Earth had heard within minutes. "Well, Claire," she said, "how do you want to do this?" And I told her the thought that had been growing in me all day, through the vote and the walk and the handshakes, the thought that had made me so strangely calm in that chamber. I said, "Alice, they think they are removing a member. They have no idea what they are actually removing. So we are going to do something they will not understand for months. We are going to leave quietly, completely, politely, and quietly. No protests, no demands. We settle every account. We hand over every duty they officially gave us, and we go home with a smile." Alice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and everything they never officially gave us. All the things our people just do out there, every day, that nobody ever wrote down? I looked out the window at the docking rings, at the endless quiet river of ships, and I felt that cold, calm certainty settle over me again. Those things stopped too, I said. Every single one. They voted to find out what the galaxy is like without us. So we are going to show them. We are going to show them exactly what we were. Alice smiled then, a small, tired smile that did not reach her eyes, and she said the words that would become our quiet order across every human ship, station, and outpost in Council space. Bring everyone home, Claire. Leave nothing broken, leave nothing owed, and leave nothing behind. When we close that door, I want it to close so gently that they do not even hear the click. I ended the call and sat alone in the dark office with the Osari friendship bowl in my lap. Below my window, a human tug was guiding a damaged Velthari freighter into dock, the way our tugs had done 10,000 times, unpaid and unasked, because the pilot saw a ship in trouble, and that is simply what we do. I watched it settle safely into its berth, and I thought, enjoy that, my friends. Memorize it, because 6 months from now, when a ship drifts out there with a dead engine and a frightened crew, you are going to look for us, and for the first time in 200 years, we will not be there. That was the day it began. Not with a war, not with a threat, not with a single raised voice. It began with a woman packing 4 gray cases, a station full of quiet handshakes, and a species deciding, all together, to grant the galaxy its wish. They wanted a galaxy without humans. They were about to get one. I kept a private log during the withdrawal. 6 months, 180 entries, written late at night in whatever bunk or cabin I happened to be in, because Alice had given me one final job before I came home. Supervise the departure. Make sure it is perfect. So instead of flying straight to Earth, I spent half a year traveling across Council space, from station to station and world to world, watching my species take itself apart piece by piece, politely, on schedule, and in full view of a galaxy that still did not understand what it was looking at. The official handovers were easy, and we made them beautiful. On Threshold Station, the great crossroads port where 40 species trade under one roof, our engineers had maintained the jump relay network for 60 years. The relays are the highways of the galaxy. Without them, a journey of days becomes a journey of decades. Our chief engineer there was a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken man named Peter Hale, who had spent his whole career inside those humming towers, and when the time came, he handed the new council maintenance team a complete set of manuals. Not just manuals. He gave them 60 years of notes. Every strange sound a relay makes before a coil fails. Every shortcut, every repair that the official documents said was impossible, with step-by-step instructions for how humans had been quietly doing it anyway. The council inspectors looked at those documents, and one of them said, with genuine surprise, "This is far more than the contract requires." Peter just nodded and said, "We know." That is rather the point. Our medics did the same. Dr. Lucy Grant, who ran the human clinic on the Osari border, spent her last month personally walking the replacement staff through every single patient file. She stayed up 3 nights in a row writing out treatment plans for beings she would never see again. On her final day, the clinic waiting room was so full of patients who had come just to say goodbye that they spilled out into the corridor, and Lucy stood in the doorway and cried, and I am told half the waiting room turned gray, or dimmed their light, or lowered their crests, each species grieving in its own way, all of them grieving the same thing. Our traders settled every account to the last decimal, every loan repaid, every contract completed or fairly closed, every deposit returned. The Council's Commerce Office actually sent us a formal note of appreciation for the orderly nature of the transition. I framed that note. I still have it. It hangs on my wall as proof of how completely they missed what was happening right in front of them. Because while they were admiring our paperwork, the other withdrawal was underway. The invisible one. The one no contract had ever covered, and no delegate had ever thought about, because none of it had ever cost the Council a single credit. Let me tell you about George Ellis. George was a freighter captain, 60 years old, a big cheerful man who hauled ore along the Serpent Run, a lonely stretch of space near the Keth frontier where pirates had once been so bad that insurance companies refused to cover the route. Officially, George was just a cargo hauler. Unofficially, George and about 30 other human captains had spent 20 years flying that route armed, in loose groups, on staggered schedules, keeping their sensors wide open and answering every distress call within range. They were not paid for it. Nobody had ever asked them to do it. They did it because they were heading that way anyway, as George liked to say, and because a pirate crew thinks twice about a convoy that always seems to have friends nearby. The Serpent Run had been quiet for so long that the Council had officially reclassified it as a safe corridor. The Council believed the pirates had simply gone away. The pirates had not gone away. They had been waiting out the humans, and only the humans knew it. In month 2 of the withdrawal, George flew the Serpent Run for the last time. He told me about it over dinner on Threshold Station, turning his cup slowly in his big hands. "Strangest run of my life," he said, "quiet as a church. And the whole way through, I kept thinking, who is going to answer the calls now?" I did not have an answer for him. Nobody did. That was the truth we were all carrying by then, every human in Council space. This heavy, silent knowledge of all the little jobs we were putting down, jobs that had no names and appeared in no records, jobs the galaxy did not know existed because we had done them so well and so long that the problems they prevented had been forgotten. The translators put their work down too. There is a human woman named Ruth Palmer who speaks 19 languages, and for a decade she had been the unofficial voice of the Meridian Border Zone, a tangled region where 6 small species live close together and misunderstand each other constantly. Ruth had no title. She had a battered shuttle and a gift, and whenever 2 settlements started shouting past each other, someone would send for Ruth, and Ruth would go, unpaid, and sit with both sides until the shouting turned back into talking. In 10 years, the Meridian Zone had not had a single serious conflict. The Council's official reports credited this to the natural maturing of the local cultures. In month 3, Ruth packed her shuttle and came home, and she told me at the departure gate, with tears standing in her eyes, they think peace is the normal state of things out there. They think it just happens by itself, like weather. The rescue pilots came home. Jack Marlowe, 29 years old, the best storm flyer I have ever met, had spent 6 years stationed at his own expense near the Cauldron, a region of violent solar weather where ships lose power a dozen times a year. Jack and his little crew had pulled more than 200 stranded crews out of that region. When he lifted off for the last time, the local traffic controllers, who were Velthari, lined up on the tower balcony to watch him go. They did not fully understand yet that no one was replacing him. They found out 11 days later, when a mining ship lost power inside the Cauldron and the controllers reached for a channel that no longer answered. The crew of that mining ship survived, barely, because their captain was clever and lucky. The next crew would not be lucky. But that comes later in this story, and I promised myself I would tell it in order. Do you see the shape of it now? Do you see what was actually leaving? The Council had voted to remove a delegation, 1 ambassador, 1 office, 1 seat in a chamber. What actually walked out of their space, over those 6 months, was a nervous system. Thousands of small human presences, woven so deep into the daily life of the galaxy that they had become invisible, the way your own heartbeat is invisible to you until the moment it stumbles. And here is the part that still amazes me. The Council watched all of it happen and saw nothing. Their observers filed reports praising the smooth transition. Their news feeds ran cheerful stories about galactic culture returning to its proper rhythm. One popular Velthari commentator gave a speech, widely shared, in which he said the departure of humanity was like the end of a loud party, and that the galaxy could finally hear itself think. The galaxy applauded him. I saved a recording of that speech too. I have listened to it exactly twice. Once when it was given, and once, much later, on a night when I needed to remind myself why I had made the choices I made. Only a few saw clearly. Varen, the Ilith speaker, requested a private meeting with me in month 4, on a garden terrace high above the council chamber. Illith grow gardens the way other species build monuments, and Varen's terrace was a quiet miracle of silver leaves and slow floating seeds. He stood among his plants and asked me a question no delegate had asked in the entire 6 months. He said, "Ambassador, what are we losing that we do not know we are losing?" And I looked at this old, graceful, honest being, one of the very few who had voted against the restructuring, and I decided he deserved a true answer. So I gave him one. I said, "Varen, you are losing everything that never appeared in your reports, and by the time you can see it, it will already be gone." He was silent for a long time. The silver leaves turned slowly in the artificial breeze. Then he said quietly, "I argued against this vote with every tool I had. It was not enough. I am ashamed." And I told him something I still believe. I said, "You have nothing to be ashamed of. Shame belongs to those who knew better and stayed silent. You spoke. Remember that you spoke, because a day is coming when this council will need beings who are not afraid to say unpopular things out loud, and on that day, they will look to you." I did not know then how right I was going to be. The last week came. Human space and council space share a long border, and through the great gate stations along that border, the final travelers streamed home. Families who had lived on council worlds for 3 generations, teachers, shipwrights, cooks, musicians. A grandmother from the Asari capital who had run a bakery there for 50 years and whose Asari neighbors filled her transport with flowers. 90 million humans, all told, moving with a calm order that astonished even me. There was grief everywhere, and long embraces at every gate, and promises to right, but there was no anger. We had all agreed, without anyone ever giving the order, that anger would be a gift to the delegates who voted against us, and we were not in a gift-giving mood. On the final day, I stood in the departure hall of the council station where it had all begun, holding a single ticket for the last human transport out of council space. The hall was crowded with station workers who had come to see us off. Morel was there, gray as winter stone. Tovan the dockmaster stood at the back, huge and motionless, and as I passed him, he raised one armored hand to his chest, the Keth salute of deep respect, a gesture their warriors use at funerals. Half the dock crew copied him. I had to stop walking for a moment. I had promised myself I would not cry in that station, and I kept the promise, but it cost me. At the boarding ramp, a council official was waiting, a young Velthari with a formal scroll, sent to witness the completion of the withdrawal. He read out the official words, confirming that humanity had discharged all obligations and that the restructuring was complete. Then he lowered the scroll, and off the record, in a voice that shook slightly, he said, "Ambassador, my mother was on a ship that lost its engines near the cauldron 9 years ago. A human pilot brought her home. I never learned his name. If you ever meet him, will you tell him that because of him, I exist near this ramp today, saying these words to you?" Jack Marlowe was standing 20 feet away in the boarding line. I could have introduced them. I have asked myself many times why I did not, and the honest answer is this. I wanted that young official to carry the question with him, unanswered, into the years ahead. I wanted at least one person inside that council to lie awake sometimes, wondering about the name of a human he could no longer thank. So I simply said, "I will tell him," and I boarded the transport. I took a seat by the window. The engines lit. The great station fell away beneath us, ring after glowing ring, the crossroads of 1,000 worlds, still bright, still busy, still utterly certain of itself. Around me the cabin was quiet. 90 million of us had already gone ahead. We few hundred were the last, the closers of the door, and every face in that cabin wore the same expression, and it was not sorrow and it was not anger. It was the expression of people who have set down a heavy load they carried for 200 years and who are waiting, with a terrible patience, to see how long it takes the ones left behind to notice the weight. I opened my log and wrote the final entry of the withdrawal. I still know it by heart. It says this: "Today we completed the quietest exit in galactic history. They removed a member. They believe that is all they removed. They do not yet understand that they removed the mortar, and that a wall without mortar still looks perfectly solid, right up until the first storm leans against it. The storm is coming. Storms always come. And when this one arrives, every being in that chamber is going to learn the difference between a galaxy that contains humans and a galaxy that is held together by them." Then I closed the log, and I watched council space shrink to a scatter of stars behind us, and I went home. The first letter arrived 26 days after I got home. I remember, because I was up a ladder painting the window frames of my new house when the delivery drone found me. I had settled on Redfield, a farming colony on the human side of the border, a green and windy world where nobody cared that I used to be an ambassador and everybody cared whether I was coming to the harvest festival. I had chickens. I had a vegetable garden that was losing a war against some very determined local beetles. I had, for the first time in my adult life, absolutely no responsibilities to anyone but myself, and I was still learning how to breathe in all that open space. The letter carried the seal of the council's commerce office. I climbed down the ladder, wiped the paint off my hands, and read it at my kitchen table. It was addressed to me personally, in beautifully formal language, and underneath all the courtesy it asked one question. It asked whether I might be able to explain certain irregularities in shipping patterns along the Serpent Run, where insurance claims had risen 400% in a single month. 400% in 1 month. George Ellis had asked me who was going to answer the calls, and now I had my answer. Nobody was. The pirates had waited exactly as long as it took to be sure we were really gone, and then they had come back to the Serpent Run like a tide coming back to a beach. 3 freighters seized in the first 3 weeks, crews held for ransom, cargo gone. The safe corridor, the one the council had reclassified with such confidence, was safe no longer, and their own records could not tell them why, because their own records had never known why it was safe in the first place. I wrote back the same evening. I was polite. I explained in simple terms about George and the 30 captains and the 20 years of unpaid, unrecorded, unofficial protection. I offered no advice and no help, because none had been requested, and I signed it, with best wishes, Claire Bennett, private citizen. Then I went back to painting my window frames. The second letter came 9 days later, from the traffic authority of the Cauldron region. I knew what it would say before I opened it, and I was right, and I want you to know that I take no pleasure in telling you this part. A survey ship had lost power deep inside the cauldron during a solar storm. The Velthari controllers had done everything correctly. They had followed every procedure in their manuals. They had requested rescue assets through the proper channels, and the proper channels had responded that the nearest qualified rescue vessel was 11 days away, and the storm had lasted 6. The ship was found afterward, silent and dark, and it was brought home to its families, and the letter from the traffic authority asked, with a kind of bewildered grief that came through even the formal language, how such gaps in coverage had gone unnoticed for so long. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I walked down the hill to the village, because Jack Marlowe, of all people, had bought the farm next to mine, the universe having a sense of humor about these things, and I found him repairing a fence in the rain, and I showed him the letter. He read it twice. Then he handed it back to me, and he looked out at the gray sky for a while, and he said, 6 days, Claire. I have flown that region in worse storms than that. I could have reached them in 9 hours, and then he went back to fixing his fence, hammering much harder than the fence required, and I walked home, and that night neither of our houses had their lights off before dawn. After that, the letters became a flood. I want to be clear that I never asked to become what I became during those months, which was a kind of unofficial complaints window for the entire council. But the delegates and departments of council space had a problem. Their treaty with humanity was now a thin, cold document of observer status, and it contained no channels for asking for help, because they had deliberately removed those channels. So they wrote to me, personally, a private citizen with a beetle problem, and because I believe in manners, I answered every single one. The letters from Threshold Station were the hardest. Threshold, the great crossroads, where Peter Hale had handed over 60 years of notes. The new maintenance teams had those notes, but notes are not hands, and notes are not instinct, and above all, notes are not permission. When Relay 7 began making the exact sound Peter had described on page 400 of his manual, the sound that means a coil will fail within 30 days, the maintenance team did precisely what their own regulations demanded. They filed a report. The report went to a committee. The committee scheduled an assessment. The assessment recommended a review, and on day 29, right on schedule, exactly as Peter's notes had promised, Relay 7 failed, and 11 trade routes went dark, and 400 ships had to reroute through crowded lanes, and the price of grain doubled on 6 worlds in a week. Here is what you must understand, because this is the heart of everything that happened. The relay did not fail because the council lacked knowledge. Peter had given them the knowledge. It failed because the council lacked the one thing humans had always smuggled into their systems without anyone noticing, which is the willingness of some ordinary person to look at a rule and say, "This rule is about to get people hurt, so today I am going to break it, and I will accept whatever trouble comes to me afterward." Peter Hale had personally violated council maintenance regulations 112 times in his career. He kept count. He was proud of it. Every single violation had prevented a failure, and every single one had been quietly forgotten by supervisors who liked their relays working. Nobody on the new team was willing to be Peter, because being Peter was never in the job description. It was never in anyone's job description. It was just in us. Then the Meridian border zone began to unravel, and I stopped sleeping properly. Ruth Palmer's tangled little region of 6 species, at peace for 10 years, quietly held together by one woman and a battered shuttle. Without her, a fishing dispute between 2 settlements went unmediated. The dispute became an insult, the insult became a boycott, and the boycott became an embargo, and within 4 months, 2 of the 6 species had recalled their diplomats and were stopping each other's ships for inspection. The council dispatched an official mediation team, fully credentialed, superbly trained, and the mediation team did what official teams do. They summoned both sides to a neutral station, seated them at a formal table, and read the rules of procedure aloud. The talks collapsed in 2 days. Ruth used to spend her first 2 weeks in a dispute, just cooking with people. She told me once, "You cannot hate someone whose grandmother's recipe you have ruined together. There is no committee in the galaxy that knows how to write that down." And then the visitors started coming to Redfield. The first one arrived in autumn, when the whole valley had turned gold. A Velthari trade envoy, ostensibly touring human agricultural methods, who spent 40 minutes admiring my beetle-ravaged garden before working up the courage to ask, with tremendous casualness, whether human freight captains might ever consider taking private security contracts along the Serpent Run. I gave him coffee. I listened with my very best diplomatic face, and I told him the truth, which was that human captains were free people, and that he was welcome to advertise, and that I suspected he would find few takers, because the last time human helpfulness had been measured by his government, it had been entered into the record as evidence of a destabilizing influence. He left before finishing his coffee. They kept coming, an Osari health commissioner who wondered whether Dr. Lucy Grant might return to the border clinic as a consultant, a special classification, very prestigious. A Keth logistics officer who asked if Peter Hale offered training seminars. A whole delegation from the Meridian Zone who wanted, and I am quoting them exactly, to hire the human woman who cooks. Each of them made the same journey, and sat in the same kitchen, and drank the same coffee, and asked, in a dozen careful ways, the same underlying question, which was this: could things please go back to the way they were, without anyone having to say sorry? And to each of them I gave the same answer. I said, "My friends, you misunderstand what happened. You did not lose a service provider. You lost a neighbor. A service provider comes back when the price is right. A neighbor comes back when the relationship is repaired, and your council has not even admitted there is anything to repair. Until that changes, I am just a farmer, and my coffee is the only thing on offer in this house." Some of them argued. Some of them pleaded. One of them, the Osari commissioner, simply nodded slowly and said, "That is a fair answer, and I will carry it home," and I respected her more than all the others combined. Through all of it, I kept in contact with Alice Turner, and through her I felt the mood of our whole species, and I will not pretend that mood was simple. Plenty of humans watched the news from Council Space with grim satisfaction, and said out loud that the Council had ordered this meal and could now eat it. I understood the feeling. Some days I shared it. But most of us, and I truly believe this, most of us felt something more complicated, a kind of sorrow with the anger folded inside it. The way you feel when someone you love does something foolish and gets hurt, and you cannot decide whether to run to them or let the lesson finish teaching itself. 90 million of us had lived out there. We had Osari friendship bowls on our shelves and Keth salutes in our memories. The galaxy was not a stranger to us. That was exactly what made it all so hard. Winter came to Redfield. The letters kept arriving, and their tone kept changing, month by month, from puzzled to worried to something that was beginning to sound like the early edge of fear. The Council's own statistics office, in a report that leaked and traveled across human space in about 6 hours, calculated that in the first year without humanity, response times to emergencies in the outer regions had grown by a factor of 9, trade route reliability had fallen by a third, and unresolved disputes between member species had reached their highest level in 4 centuries. The report's final line became briefly famous. It said, "The withdrawal of the human presence appears to have removed capabilities that were never captured in any official accounting, and the committee recommends further study to determine what those capabilities were." Further study. To determine what we were. They were commissioning research to discover their own neighbors. I read that line standing in my kitchen, and I laughed, and then quite suddenly I was not laughing, and I had to sit down. Then, on the longest night of the Redfield winter, with snow ticking against the windows, my comm chimed with a priority signal I had not heard in over a year. A direct diplomatic channel, the old kind, the kind that had officially been closed to me the day I ceased to be an ambassador. Someone with very high access had opened it anyway. I accepted the call, and the screen filled with silver leaves and slow-floating seeds, and there stood Varen of the Illith, in his garden above the council chamber, and the moment I saw his face, I knew this was not about pirates or relays or embargoes, because Varen looked like a being who had seen something in the dark and could not stop seeing it. "Claire," he said, and even his glass-wind voice was unsteady, "forgive the intrusion, and forgive the hour. I need you to listen, and I need you to hear me as a friend, because officially, what I am about to tell you does not exist." I sat down slowly. "Tell me," I said. He told me, far past the rim of council space, out beyond the last mapped systems, there is a region every spacefaring species knows and none of them visits. A wide dark stretch, the old charts mark, with a single Illith word that means the place that eats light. Long ago, before humans ever left their world, something came out of that darkness, a swarm of ancient machines, patient and cold, that fed on power itself, draining ships and stations and whole worlds into silence. The species of that era stopped it, barely, at a cost the old records describe only in fragments, and it retreated into the dark, and the council sealed the whole matter, and over the slow centuries the seals became archives, and the archives became legends, and the legends became a bedtime story that even delegates no longer believed. Varen believed. Varen had spent 40 years quietly reading the sealed records, because Illith live long and remember longer, and Varen had just received, through channels he would not name even to me, sensor data from 3 separate deep survey posts along the rim. All 3 posts had recorded the same thing. A pattern of small, cold, precise power drains, moving slowly inward from the dark region, in a formation the sealed records described exactly. The swarm was awake. It was still far away, and it was still slow, and there was still time, but it was moving, and it was moving toward the light, and the noise, and the rich glowing energy of council space. the way it had before. And here is the sentence Varen said next, the sentence I have never forgotten, the sentence that ended my quiet life on Redfield as surely as the vote had ended my life on the station. He looked at me through the screen, this old and honest being standing alone in his garden in the middle of his night, and he said, "Claire, 40 years I have studied how the ancients survived it, and the records all agree on one thing. They survived because when the darkness came, every hand in the galaxy moved at once, without waiting for permission. Every hand, Claire, and I am standing here tonight, looking at my council, and all I can think is that we have just spent a year teaching ourselves to file reports while relays fail, and the only species in the galaxy that never waits for permission has gone home and closed the door. The snow ticked against my windows. My tea had gone cold beside me. Somewhere out past the rim of everything, something ancient and patient was drifting toward the light. Varen, I said, what are you asking me? I do not know yet, he said. Perhaps only this. When it comes, and it will come, my council will eventually swallow its pride and call for humanity. It will take them far too long, and they will do it badly, and they will dress it in procedure. When that day arrives, I am asking you to remember that some of us saw clearly. I am asking you to be, for your whole stubborn species, what you have always been in that chamber, the one who stands up first. The channel closed. I sat in my kitchen for a long time, listening to the snow, and then I got up, and I put on my coat, and I walked through the dark to Jack Marlowe's farm, because some news cannot wait for morning, and because I already knew, deep down where the truth lives, that my window frames were never going to get their second coat of paint. The first system went dark in spring. It was called Pharaoh's Reach on our charts, a small mining settlement on the far rim, 11,000 colonists of 4 different species, and one morning its beacon simply stopped. The council sent a survey ship, and the survey ship found the settlement intact, every dome standing, every corridor undamaged, and every power cell, every reactor, every battery, every glow lamp, drained to absolute zero. The colonists had seen it coming, with just enough warning to evacuate on chemical rockets, the old fire and thrust kind, the only engines the swarm cannot taste, and they had escaped with their lives and nothing else. The survey ship's report described a settlement like a seashell on a beach, perfect and empty, with every trace of warmth gone out of it. The council classified the report. Of course they did. They classified it, and they formed a committee, and the committee requested the sealed archives, and the archive office replied that the sealed archives required a 2/3 vote to open, and the vote was scheduled, and delayed, and rescheduled, and while the oldest and most careful civilization in the galaxy debated the rules for reading its own warnings, a second system went dark. Then a third. The swarm was not fast. That was the terrible mercy of it, and the terrible shame of it all at once. It drifted from system to system over weeks, slow enough that almost everyone escaped ahead of it, slow enough that the refugee convoys could stay ahead of the silence, and slow enough that there was never a single dramatic moment that forced the council to act. It was a disaster with no explosion in it. It was the tide coming in, one quiet centimeter at a time, and committees do not know how to fear a tide. Varen fought them from the floor of the chamber. He gave a speech in that great room, and someone leaked the recording, and I have watched it more times than I can count. He stood in front of 300 delegates and read aloud from the sealed records that his 40 years of quiet study had already given him, read them the old accounts of the place that eats light, and then he pointed at the great amber display above the speaker's platform, where the darkened systems glowed like missing teeth in the map of the galaxy, and he said, "Honored delegates, the ancients did not survive this because they were wise. They survived because they were fast. Show me, in this chamber, where we keep our fast." They censured him. I want that written into the record of this story, because history should remember it. They formally censured the one delegate who had seen it coming for the crime of citing sealed documents without authorization. And then, in the very same session, with the kind of logic that only a dying institution can produce, they voted to open negotiations with humanity regarding the crisis. not to ask for help, to open negotiations regarding, even drowning. They reached for procedure the way a drowning man reaches for anything floating. The summons arrived on Earth with full ceremony, carried by a delegation of 9 senior council officials aboard a diplomatic cruiser, and it was addressed to the government of the human peoples, and it requested, in 11 pages of flawless formal language, that humanity make available its capabilities for the purpose of collective response coordination, under council command, subject to council procedure, with terms of human participation to be defined by a joint framework committee. 11 pages, and not one of them contained the word help, and not one of them contained the word sorry, and not one of them acknowledged, even in a footnote, that they had voted us out of the family and were now asking us to run into the burning house. Alice Turner received the delegation in the Great Hall in Geneva, and I watched the broadcast from Redfield with my heart in my throat, because I knew Alice, and I could see the stillness in her, the farmer's patience wrapped around something harder. She let them read all 11 pages aloud. She thanked them for the journey, and then she asked one question, gently, the way you ask a question you already know the answer to. She said, "This framework committee, this collective response under council command, tell me, honored envoys, under what authority would human ships operate in your space?" And the lead envoy consulted his documents and replied that human vessels would operate under observer status with special provisions, and Alice nodded slowly and said, "Observer status, so we may watch, but we may not matter. I believe those were the terms your council chose for us." And she stood up, which meant the audience was over, and she said, "Take this answer home. Humanity does not send its children into danger as observers. When your council is ready to speak to us as neighbors, our door has never had a lock on it. Until then, we wish you safe travels, and we mean that sincerely, because the roads out there are not what they were." Human space erupted. You have to understand what those months were like for us. Every family screen carried the maps of council space, with the dark systems spreading across them like spilled ink, and every human alive was having the same argument at the same dinner table. Half of us cheered Alice's answer. They said the council had spent 2 centuries taking us for granted, and 1 year learning better, and that the lesson was not finished, and that humanity should fortify its own border, take in whatever refugees came, and let the oldest civilizations in the galaxy reap the harvest of their own pride. And I want to be honest, as I promised to be from the start. That argument was not cruel, and it was not stupid. The swarm was drifting toward council space, not ours. Our worlds were safe. Our children were safe. No one owes their neighbor a rescue that the neighbor's own vote made necessary. That is what half my species said, and they said it while donating to refugee funds and opening their ports to evacuee convoys, because even our anger has soft hands, and I have never been prouder of the complicated hearts of my people. But I was in the other half, and the other half said this. We said, the pirates on the Serpent Run did not vote against us, and they suffered. The families in the Cauldron did not vote against us. The 11,000 colonists of Pharaoh's Reach did not vote against us, and neither did the bakery customers of the Osari capital, and neither did Mirel with her gray grieving hands, and neither did Tovan with his funeral salute, and neither did a young Velthari official whose mother was pulled out of a storm by a pilot whose name he never learned. 300 delegates voted against us. 100 trillion beings did not, and a species that punishes the 100 trillion to teach the 300 a lesson has learned the Council's disease and simply given it a human name. I made that argument everywhere. I made it on news feeds and in town halls and in the Redfield Village pub, where at least the arguments came with decent food. I wrote it to Alice directly, and Alice wrote back one line that I have kept, because it was so exactly her. She wrote, "Claire, I agree with your heart, but I answer to all of them, not just to the ones who agree with you, and I will not send a single ship until the Council says the words." And I knew which words she meant. Not 11 pages of framework language. 3 words, or something like them. We were wrong. That was the price, and it was the smallest price in the history of diplomacy, and the Council could not pay it, because pride is the one debt that ancient civilizations refuse to settle. So the maps kept darkening, and the convoys kept streaming, and the council kept scheduling votes about votes, and I stopped sleeping again, and one gray morning I walked out to my barn and pulled the dust cover off the thing I had never told anyone I owned. She was a courier ship, 40 years old, a design called a Lark, small and quick, the kind the diplomatic service used to run sealed messages before the relay network made them obsolete. I had bought her at a surplus auction 2 decades earlier, out of pure sentiment, because I had flown ships like her when I was young, and being an ambassador had not yet swallowed my whole life. Jack Marlowe had helped me keep her flight worthy, weekend by weekend, as a hobby, the way some neighbors restore old tractors. She had a chemical booster stage for emergencies, the old fire and thrust kind, the only engines the swarm cannot taste. I stood in my barn looking at her for a long time, and then I went into the house and I wrote 3 letters. The first was to Alice. I told her what I was going to do, and I told her plainly that it was not a challenge to her authority, because I was a private citizen with a registered ship, and the border was open to private travel, and everything I intended was, if you squinted at the regulations in a poor light, technically legal. I told her I was not going to fight anything, because I had no weapons and no wish for any. I was going to fly to Threshold Station, where the refugee convoys were tangling into chaos, and I was going to stand in the middle of that chaos and start organizing it, as one pair of human hands, because somebody had to be first, and because a very wise old being in a garden had once asked me to be the one who stands up. The second letter was to Varen. It contained 1 sentence. It said, "Look for a small ship called the Lark, and have the tea ready." The third letter I left on Jack Marlowe's kitchen table, weighted down with his own spare fence hammer, because he was in town that morning and I am, at my core, a coward about goodbyes. It said, "Jack, I have taken our ship, and I am sorry, and I am not sorry, and you of all people know exactly where I am going and exactly why, and if you follow me I will be furious with you for at least 5 minutes. The kettle is yours. Feed my chickens." Then I walked back to the barn, and I ran the checks we had run together, 100 lazy weekends, and I rolled the Lark out under a cold spring sky, and I lifted off from Redfield without looking back at my house, because I knew that if I looked back I would see the window frames still waiting for their second coat, and some sights can break a person at exactly the wrong moment. I crossed the border at the Meridian Gate at local midnight. The gate station queried my transponder, and I watched the query sit on my screen, and I thought about 11 years and 4,000 walks down a crystal corridor, and then I sent my response in plain text, the old courier way. It said, "Vessel Lark, 1 soul aboard, Claire Bennett, private citizen, destination Threshold Station, purpose of travel," and then I sat with my fingers over the keys for a moment, and I typed the truest thing I have ever put in an official document. "Purpose of travel," I wrote, "visiting neighbors." The gate opened, and I flew back into the dark alone. Threshold Station, when I reached it, was a picture of everything that had gone wrong. The great Crossroads port hung in space with half its docking rings jammed solid, hundreds of refugee ships stacked in holding patterns that stretched for 1,000 kilometers, families from 9 darkened systems packed aboard freighters and liners and mining barges, all of them waiting for berth assignments from a station authority that was processing arrivals in strict order of application, with full documentation review, exactly as the regulations required. Ships with 3 days of air were queued behind ships with 3 months of supplies, because the rules made no distinction, and the rules were all anyone had left. I listened to the traffic channels for 1 hour, and in that hour I heard 100 voices asking for instructions, and not one voice giving any. So I gave some. I want to be clear about what I actually did that first day, because the stories that grew up around it later made it sound like magic, and it was not magic. It was a checklist. I docked the Lark at a maintenance port that Peter Hale's old notes said was always kept clear, and I walked into the harbor master's office, and I introduced myself to the exhausted Velthari officer in charge, and I asked her one question. I asked, "If the regulations disappeared for 1 day, what would you do first?" And she stared at me And then she said, "Air. I would sort them by air." And I said, "Then let us do that, and I will sign every form afterward and take the blame for all of it. My name carries a little weight out here. Spend it." We sorted them by air. It took 11 hours, my voice on one channel and hers on the other, moving ships like beads on a string, and I will not pretend it was orderly, and I will not pretend the station's senior administrators thanked us, because what they actually did was file a formal complaint against me, a private human citizen directing traffic without authorization. They filed it, and the harbor master logged it, and we kept working, because by then the first miracle had already started, and the miracle was this: beings had begun helping. That is all. That is the whole miracle. The crews of the docked freighters, who had been sitting for days waiting for someone to tell them what to do, heard a voice on the channel handing out jobs, and they took the jobs. An Asari liner captain volunteered her ship's kitchens and fed 3,000 strangers. Keth miners cut their cargo loose and turned their barge into a dormitory. The young Velthari translator, who had once dreamed in English, still posted on threshold after all those months, appeared at my elbow without being asked and did not leave it for a week. It turns out that a crowd does not need much to become a community. It needs one voice willing to be responsible so that everyone else can be generous. Humans have known that forever. We just never knew we knew it until we watched a galaxy forget it. On the third day, the swarm's leading edge drained a system called Verril's Lamp, 4 jumps from threshold, and the mathematics of the situation became simple enough for even the station administrators to understand. Threshold was the largest concentration of power and life within the swarm's drift path. The crossroads of the galaxy was, to a thing that eats light, the brightest meal ever set on a table. Evacuation of the station's permanent population alone would take months. We had weeks. And on the 4th day, the second miracle happened, and this one I truly did not plan, and no one who tells you otherwise is telling the truth. I was asleep for the first time in 3 days when the harbor master shook me awake, and her skin was flushed the color Velthari turn when they are overwhelmed, and she pulled me to the observation deck, and she pointed, and I looked out at the approach lanes of Threshold Station and saw them coming out of the dark. Human ships. Not a fleet. Nothing so tidy as a fleet. It was a mess, and it was the most beautiful mess I have ever seen. Battered freighters from the border worlds. Retired patrol boats that private collectors had bought at auction and lovingly maintained. Mining rigs with their cutting arrays refitted to project power decoys. Hospital ships. Tug clusters, farm supply haulers stuffed to the ceiling with food and blankets and air scrubbers. 200 ships in the first wave, then 500, then more, streaming through the Meridian Gate in ragged lines, every one of them a private vessel crewed by volunteers, every one of them flying without orders, without command, without permission, because the news of one stubborn woman in an old courier ship had crossed human space in about a day, and my species had responded the way my species always responds to the sight of one of its own, standing alone in front of something enormous. They came because I went. I have had to make my peace with that sentence, with the weight of it, and leading the third wave, in a patched cargo runner with the words Redfield Volunteer Group painted on the hull in what was unmistakably my own leftover window paint, came Jack Marlowe, who docked, and found me on the observation deck, and stood in front of me with his arms crossed, and said, "You owe me 5 minutes of fury, I believe, and I will take them whenever convenient." And I put my face in my hands and laughed until I could not breathe, and it was the first time I had laughed since spring. They kept coming. George Ellis arrived with 40 freighter captains from the old Serpent Run group. Dr. Lucy Grant landed with 3 fully staffed medical ships and took over the station's overwhelmed clinics before anyone thought to authorize her. Ruth Palmer appeared in her battered shuttle and within 2 days had the leaders of 9 refugee species cooking together in the Asari liner's kitchens, hammering out birth disputes over ruined recipes. And Peter Hale, 63 years old, walked back into the relay control center he had run for 60 years, looked at the frightened new maintenance team, and said, "Right, Lessons resume. First lesson is which rules we are breaking today, and by evening, he had Relay 7's replacement coil running at full song. Alice Turner called me that night on an open channel, and the whole galaxy could listen, and I think she wanted it that way. She said, "Claire, I told you I would not send a single ship until the Council said the words. It seems my citizens have voted with their engines instead, and it is not the business of a free government to stand between its people and their neighbors. So I am not sending ships, I am sending everything else." And behind her signal came the manifests, the real weight of a species leaning in, industrial power plants, evacuation planners, the survey data from every human deep space expedition that had ever brushed the edge of the place that eats light. Humanity had never stopped studying the dark. We are the species that pokes things. It turned out our old expeditions knew more about the swarm's behavior than the Council's sealed archives did, because the archives described the swarm of 8,000 years ago, and our probes had measured the swarm of today. And that knowledge, in the end, is how Threshold was saved, so let me tell you how it actually happened. Because it was not a battle in any way the old stories understand the word, and I am glad of that, and I hope you will be too. The swarm hunts warmth and power the way moths hunt a lamp. It cannot be fought with force, because force is energy, and it drinks energy, and every weapon ever fired at it in the ancient records only fed it. The ancients survived by starving it and misdirecting it, at a cost of whole abandoned regions, because misdirection on that scale needs thousands of coordinated moves made quickly across enormous distances, and the ancients could barely manage it, and the Council of today, we all knew, could not manage it at all. Their command structure needed 11 approvals to reroute a mail shipment, so we did not use their command structure. We used ours, which is to say, we used none. What we had instead was 10,000 humans and, by the end, 100,000 volunteers of 40 species working alongside them, all trusted to make their own decisions inside one shared plan. The plan was simple enough to say in a sentence: make the darkness boring and make the distance bright. Every system in the swarm's path went dark on purpose, powered down to embers, reactors cold, cities running on chemical generators and candlelight, whole worlds holding their breath. And out beyond them, along a curving path that led away from the living galaxy and back toward the empty rim, we built a trail of lures, hundreds of them, old hulks and mining rigs and surplus power plants, each one blazing with free energy, each one timed to light up as the last one drained, a string of festival lanterns leading the tide back out to sea. The Council could never have built that trail in time, not because they lacked the ships or the power, but because every lantern was somebody's property, every darkened city was somebody's jurisdiction, every timing decision was somebody's authority, and their whole civilization was a machine for making sure nobody moved until everybody agreed. Our civilization, it turns out, is a machine for the opposite. A human tug captain who saw a gap in the lantern chain did not file a report about the gap. She flew her own ship into the gap, powered up her engines to full blaze, and became the lantern, and then talked her way through the consequences afterward. That happened, by the way. Her name is Grace Holden, and she sat in that gap for 9 hours, while the leading edge of the swarm drifted past her position close enough to read her hull markings, drinking the decoys ahead of her, and behind her, and ignoring her ship entirely because Jack Marlowe had realized, in a sleepless flash of the improvisation the Council once listed among our defects, that the swarm ignores chemical burn signatures, and had spent 2 frantic days teaching 400 volunteer crews to run their ships on booster chemistry alone. The old fire and thrust kind, the oldest human trick in space. We rode fire, like our grandparents did, and the darkness looked straight through us. It took 5 weeks, 5 weeks of held breath, of worlds gone deliberately dark, of lantern after lantern flaring and fading along that long curve back toward the rim. And at the end of it, the deep survey posts confirmed what our probes were already showing us. The swarm had followed the trail past the last lantern and out beyond the mapped systems, back into the place that eats light, drifting slower now, sated and aimless, with nothing ahead of it but the silence it came from. This time, we left monitors behind, human-built, self-powered, a permanent watch on the dark, so that no future generation would ever again need 40 years of one Alith's forbidden reading to know what was coming. The place that eats light is still there. It will always be there. But now it is watched, and the galaxy knows the recipe, and the recipe is written in plain language in every library on every world, because we insisted, and the first line of the recipe says, "When the darkness comes, every hand moves at once, without waiting for permission." Varen's line. In every library, on every world, I made certain of it. 2 months later, the Galactic Council convened a full ceremonial session, and this time the invitation was addressed to me by name, and this time it was 4 lines long, and the 4th line said, "Please come, we were wrong." Alice offered to send a state delegation, an honor guard, a proper diplomatic cruiser. I flew the Lark. Jack rode along, officially as my pilot, actually because neither of us could quite imagine the other one arriving at that station alone. The crystal corridors glowed gold around us the whole 11-minute walk, and the working beings of the station lined that walk 3 deep, Mirel and Tovan and the young translator and hundreds more, and the Keth dock crews held their salute from the moment I stepped off the ramp until the chamber doors closed behind me, and I had promised myself, once, that I would never cry in that station, and I am here to tell you that some promises are made to be gently, thoroughly broken. The chamber was full, 300 delegates, and the galleries packed above them, and the great amber map overhead showing a galaxy with no missing teeth in it. Varen stood at the speaker's platform, no longer censured, newly and unanimously elected to lead the council, which was the one piece of news from that whole year that had made me genuinely whoop out loud in my kitchen. He read the resolution before the chamber, and it was everything the old council could never have written. Full restoration of human membership, a permanent seat on the inner circle, a formal unqualified apology, entered into the record for all time, for what the resolution itself called the gravest error of judgment in the history of this body. And then Varen looked down at me from the platform, and his glass-wind voice went soft, and he said, "Ambassador Bennett, the floor is yours, and the answer is yours, and whatever it is, this chamber has learned to listen." I stood up. I smoothed the front of my jacket. Some habits are load-bearing. "Honored delegates," I said, 2 years ago I stood in this room and thanked you for an education. I meant it then and I mean it more now, so let me tell you what we all learned. You learned that some things do not appear in any accounting, that safety looks like luck until it leaves, that the neighbor who irritates you and the neighbor who holds your roof up can be the same neighbor. Those were expensive lessons, and you have paid for them honestly, and as far as my species is concerned, the account is settled, and the door is open, and it will not close again. But we learned something too, I said, and this is the part I ask you to hear. We learned what we are. For 200 years we helped you while quietly hoping you would one day tell us we belonged. That hope is gone, and I am glad it is gone, because it was never the true reason our ships answered your distress calls, and we know that now, because you took the membership away, and our ships came anyway. We do not help because of seats and titles. We help because someone is drowning, and we are the sort of creature that jumps in the water. You cannot vote that in, and you cannot vote it out. It is simply what we are, and it took losing everything else for us to find it out. So here is humanity's answer. We accept the apology, completely and gladly, and we will hold no grudge, because grudges are heavy and we have work to do. But we respectfully decline the permanent seat, and we decline the inner circle, and we ask instead for something better. Give us the door. Make us your neighbors in law, the way we have always been your neighbors in fact. Write a new kind of treaty, one with no ranks in it, one that simply says, when any hand in this galaxy reaches out, every other hand moves. We will sign that treaty first, and largest, and we will spend the next 200 years proving it means what it says. You mistook our patience for weakness, and you mistook our leaving for surrender. We did not leave quietly because we were beaten. We left quietly because we knew, all the way down, that you would call, and that we would answer, and that when the answering was done, we could finally stand in this room and be seen, at last, for what we actually are. Not your disruption, not your servants, not your rescuers, your neighbors. That is the whole of it, and it was always the whole of it, and it is enough. I gathered my tablet. I pushed in my chair, the way my mother taught me when I was 6 years old, and I turned to walk out of the Galactic Council chamber exactly as I had walked out of it 2 years before, at the same measured pace, through the same enormous silence. Except the silence broke. It started somewhere high in the galleries, one pair of hands, then a Keth drum roll of armored fists, then the chiming Velthari, then the Osari with their deep humming, then the whole chamber, every delegate, every species, 300 worlds of them rising to their feet in a storm of every kind of sound that joy makes across the galaxy. And Varen stood tallest of all at the platform with his silver head bowed, and Jack was waiting at the doors trying very hard to look like a professional pilot and failing completely, and I walked that long floor through the standing thunder of a council that had finally understood. They watched humanity leave quietly, once, and knew their mistake within a heartbeat, and took 2 years to say so. Let them tell that part of the story. My part ends differently. My part ends with a small old courier ship rising from the docking rings that same evening, past a station glowing gold from ring to ring, carrying 2 farmers home to a valley where the harvest festival was starting, where the chickens were scandalously overfed, and where a set of window frames waited patiently for their second coat of paint. And got it, at long last, the following spring, in a shade the paint catalog called Council Amber, because even a retired ambassador is allowed exactly one joke at history's expense. We are the neighbors. We were always the neighbors. And the light stays on in our window, for whoever needs it, for as long as we are here,